Shalom Aleichem. We were just talking about stiff-neckedness. Am kashe oref. Chazal say that Am Yisrael azim sheba umov. Azim has a lot to do with this concept of obstinacy. Obstinacy can be a very positive thing when it's directed at the right kind of purpose. In other words, it's good to be obstinate and to be insistent upon the truth and following that truth, and not accepting reasons of expedience or other motivations for deviating from that truth. When obstinacy is used for other purposes, for other reasons, then it's a negative trait. And this is true for many midot, but it's definitely true for obstinacy. And this has a lot to do with our discussion that we're about to resume now regarding Tefillin, because as we will see, and as we will try and sum up in the Shiur, the sources and the reasons why one must wear Tefillin on HaMoed, specifically and in a more general sense, why certain kinds of arguments should not be accepted and should not be allowed into the Beth Midrash, as it were, should not be allowed to confuse the Torah discussion. This has a lot to do with being azim, in other words, being insistent, not obstinate in the negative sense, but insistent that things have to be true and things have to make sense, and that texts have a certain integrity, and you can't simply do with the text whatever you wish, because at the moment you accept that a text can always be explained away, you can always give a perush which will nullify or modify the meaning of the text. In other words, the text itself doesn't tell you anything. The text is like plasticine. You can shape it and work with it anyhow you please. That is a very negative thing. And this is something which has most certainly invaded Torah debate and halachic debate for a long time now, and this is something to which I am very opposed, and I hope that you also learn to be very opposed to it, because it is simply pulling the wool over people's eyes and turning the Torah into a specific agenda. Everyone has an agenda. In the case of Tefillin or HaMoed or other related issues, or in general other issues where the texts of Hazal indicate one thing and certain Kabbalistic texts might indicate something else, this inevitably comes down to a question of agenda. What is your agenda? What position are you trying to bolster? In other words, when a person, whether that person is a Rav or a Jew, has to decide for himself, and in the end, every Jew does have to decide for himself what he's going to do on any given topic, and a Jew cannot always hide behind the back of someone else and say, well, he told me that it's okay, or he said to me I don't have to do this, or something like that. In the final analysis, a person has to, even when choosing a Rav that he asks questions of, he should choose carefully someone who has integrity, intellectual honesty, as well as knowledge, because knowledge per se is a tool. It's using that knowledge wisely and honestly that that produces the desired result. So in the final analysis, every person has to make that decision, whether he's going to be intellectually honest and stand up for what he feels or knows to be true. If something doesn't sit well with you, chances are that there's something not right about that thing. And we have to listen to our instincts as well, not in the face of clear, demonstrable facts. In that case, if there are clear, demonstrable facts which contradict your instinct, then perhaps there's something wrong with your instinct. But when in fact the opposite is the case, where there is no reasonable, logical argument against what your heart tells you, or what your mind tells you, and specifically if both your heart and your mind agree that something is wrong with this approach or this opinion, then Hashem gave us this wisdom, this inner voice, both in the intellect and this inner voice, in order to make such decisions and to follow that which is true. That's by way of general introduction. So now let us go back for a moment to the Sugya and Eruvin that we looked at last week. We're looking at the beginning of Perek Asiri, which is Daf Sadeh HaMoed Aleph at the bottom. Okay, we begin. The Mishnah states, HaMoed Tefillin Machnisan Zug Zug. HaMoed Tefillin, he who finds a pair of Tefillin. We're talking here, of course, on Shabbat. Rashi says, B'sadeh b'makom shene evadim, in the field, for example. Outside the village or the town, you're walking in the field and you come across Tefillin lying on the ground. Now that's something which we obviously do not wish to see. We can't allow Tefillin, which are like a mini Sefer Torah, to be lying on the ground in such a fashion. On the other hand, you can't carry on Shabbat, so what do? The Mishnah states, Machnisan Zur Zur, you wear them, as we do during the week. You put them on one pair at a time, Zur Zur, Shel Yad and Shel Rosh, and you walk into town, and walk into the nearest house, or your own house, take them off, and put them on the table, or in the cupboard, or wherever it is. And now you have prevented these Tefillin from being in a state of bizayon. Bizayon being disrespect. Rabban Gamliel Omer, Shanaim, Shanaim. He agrees with everything we just said, except that Rabban Gamliel says you can do this 2 pairs at a time. The relevance of this, of course, is if one comes across 2 pairs or more. Let's say, for argument's sake, you come across 4 pairs. The difference would be, therefore, that according to the Tanakh Kama, you would have to go back and forth 4 times. And it could even be 2 kilometers out of town. So it's quite a lot of walking and quite a lot of time. 4 trips there and back. Whereas according to Rabban Gamliel, you could do it in 2 trips. By the way, it does not have to be in the field, as Rashi says. It could also be in the street, inside the city, lying on the ground on the main street, Reshut HaRabim, a place where you can't carry. The same would apply. There, the distance wouldn't apply. You'd be in town already, so it wouldn't be much of a walk, probably. But again, it depends how many trips, how many times you have to go in and out of the house or whatever to get those tefillin into an acceptable situation. Now, on this Mishnah, the Rambam, in his Perush on the Mishnah, says as follows. Rambam says, Zug Zug, 1 pair at a time, Kolomar, Tefillin shel Rosh, Tefillin shel Yad, Sheniach shel Yad biyado, V'shel Rosh berosho, Lefi shehu sover Shabbat zaman Tefillin. Rambam explains, based on what we saw last week, that on Daf Sadeh HaMoed Beth, line 47, 46, 47, the Talmud Bavli states, attempting to explain the difference or the reason for this difference between the Tanakh Kama, or we can also call it Hachamim, right, the Stam Mishnah, and Rabban Gamliel. The Talmud Bavli states, "V'hacha b'Shabbat zaman tefillin kamipalghe." The Tana Kama savar Shabbat zaman tefillin hu v'Rabban Gamliel savar Shabbat lo zaman tefillin hu. And Rashi explains, this is opposite line 30. Rashi says, "Tana Kama savar Shabbat zaman tefillin hu u'mishum hasala la mishru be tafe min ha'miswa." The Tanakama who says that one may take one pair in at a time only and not more, and the reason we allow this, of course, is because we want to prevent the bizayon to the tefillin. You're only allowed to do so one pair at a time, because that is how the miswah is normally performed, one pair at a time. This already indicates, or in fact proves, that the notion, again, surprisingly or not surprisingly, which is rooted in certain Kabbalistic texts, the notion that one should lechatchila be wearing two pairs of tefillin at the same time, namely Shel Rashi and Shel Rabbeinu Tam, which is an idea which is associated with the Ari, particularly, is not correct. The Gra also brought a proof from this sugya against this idea of wearing two pairs of tefillin at the same time, because we see here that the Gemara is explaining that according to the Tanakama who holds that Shabbat is man tefillin, whether there is in fact such a view we'll discuss a bit later, but first of all the Talmud Bavli is suggesting, is positing, that the Tanakama who says one pair at a time says that Shabbat is a time for wearing tefillin. By the way, you also have to therefore assume in this particular case that this person walking along on Shabbat and then finding these tefillin lying on the ground was for some strange reason not wearing tefillin. Because if he's already wearing a pair of tefillin, he can't wear another pair. Correct? or you have to remove his pair and put his on the ground, which just doesn't make any sense.
Nobody suggests this?
I don't. I'm just telling you the facts. Yeah. Logical, straightforward logic. That if Shabbat is a man tefillin, and we know that the proper kiyum of this miswah is wearing tefillin all day or many hours during the day, and we know that this is what many people did. Not all people, but certainly Talmidei Chachamim, in the sense that we not in the sense that the term is used today, but in the sense that it should be understood. Talmidei Chachamim means what we would call today B'nai Torah, people who went to yeshiva for a year or two, people who are serious about Torah Mitzvot. That's called, those are Talmidei Chachamim. People did this. So if Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin, one should be asking the question, according to the Tanakama, why was this person that you're referring to, who is now being told to wear a pair of tefillin that he finds lying on the ground in order to bring them into the town or into the nearest house from the Rishut Harabim, why is he not wearing tefillin? Not clear. At any rate, Rashi continues, Dalau Takshit Ninho. Rashi introduces here another concept, which is not really essential. One can explain the Mishnah without even getting into this concept of tachshit. The word tachshit means an ornament or something which is worn as a kind of as some form of jewelry, or something which gives honor to the person who wears it. So the Tanakama holds Shabbat is man tefillin. Tefillin are not considered a tachshit, because if it's considered a tachshit, then you can wear it on Shabbat, just like you can wear a chain around your neck on Shabbat if it's a tachshit, right? Why is it mutar? Why is it not carrying? Because it's something you wear and it's considered a tachshit. A person doesn't wear a string tied around his neck with a shoe tied to it on Shabbat. Why not? Because that's not a tachshit, and that's not what people do. So clearly what you're doing is carrying on Shabbat, correct? But if you wear a gold chain around your neck, then that's not carrying, that's wearing a tachshit, and that's mutar. V'chol sheken dechewan dezman tefillin hu u'ika bal tosif. There's another element that the Talmud Bavli and also Rashi here introduces into this discussion. That's the issue of bal tosif, which we will see presently the Talmud Yerushalmi rejects. Ateh isur bal tosif u'mashue leho ale kamasoy. But particularly if we say that wearing two pairs at a time is considered bal tosif, So then the one of those two pairs that you're wearing is not considered a miswah that you're wearing. It's considered something you're carrying. Like I said, like wearing a shoe tied around your neck. Why? Because you don't wear two pairs of tefillin. So one of them is clearly not for the purpose of tefillin. One of them is for the purpose of carrying it. This is how Rashi explains this view of the Tanna Kama. In other words, the HaMoed Bavli says the Tanna Kama holds that Shabbat is man tefillin, and that's why you can only wear one pair at a time. Why? Because that's how tefillin are normally worn, one pair at a time, and more than one pair at a time is not the normal way of Kiyum HaMiswah, and this is Shabbat now, and Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin, so you can wear Tefillin like any time, any day during the year, any day during the week, and therefore you should do it one pair at a time. Whereas Rabban Gamliel holds, says the HaMoed Bavli here, that Shabbat is not Zaman Tefillin, which is the halakha that all the Poskim agree upon, that Shabbat is not a time for wearing Tefillin. And it's a bit counterintuitive. You would think that he who says that Shabbat is not Zaman Tefillin would hold that you can't wear Tefillin on Shabbat if you find them lying on the ground. But Dafka, we are told here, it's the opposite. That he who holds that Shabbat is not Zaman Tefillin says you can actually wear two. And why is that? Because Rashi explains, Rabban Gamliel Savar la Zaman Tefillin hu wahainu ta'ama d'sharo le Rabbanan lahasala mishum takshitu. Because Rabban Gamliel holds that wearing Tefillin is like wearing an ornament, like wearing a chain. You're allowed to wear it. Hilkach kol kama d'hawed takshit shareh. So as long as it is considered a takshit, an ornament, like a chain or a gold watch or something, it's mutar. It's not considered carrying. Umishum bal tosif leka, and again, according to the assumption of the HaMoed Bavli, there's an inyan of bal tosif involved in wearing two pairs of tefillin. That also is not true, seeing that Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin. The end can miswah Tefillin klal, because now on Shabbat there's no miswah of Tefillin, so they can't be bal tosif. Ela keshar malbush ba'alma. So it's just like wearing some article of clothing or some ornament. And the Talmud explained to us a moment before, which that makom yesh barosh lahaniach bo shtei tefillin, that's on line 30, and the Talmud explained that this is correct both for the shariat and the shalosh. There is room on one's arm, as I explained. This only is true if one wears small tefillin, but there is room on one's arm for two pairs of tefillin, and there is room on one's head for two pairs of tefillin. So, according to Rabban Gamliel, as long as you're wearing tefillin, b'makom tefillin, in the place where on another day of the week, not Shabbat, you would be mekem the miswah if you wore the tefillin on that spot. Because clearly, if you wear tefillin here, you put the tefillin on the side of your head, you're not being mekem the miswah of tefillin, and then you're carrying. But if you put the tefillin on a place where normally you would be mekem the miswah of tefillin, were this to be a Tuesday or a Wednesday, then you are wearing tefillin in the normal manner, just as a person wears a gold chain in the normal manner around his neck, and it's not considered carrying. He's considered to be wearing something. This is how the Talmud explains the mahloket between the Tanna Kama and Rabban Gamliel. It is true that the Talmud Bavli attempts all manner of other explanations, but eventually on Daf Sadiwa Amud Aleph, on 9:12, the Gemara says, "Ela mahawarfa kedushanenan mi'ikara." It is clear that the correct explanation is as we explained at the beginning, namely that the mahloket between Tanna Kama and Rabban Gamliel is there in fact is Shabbat Zman Tefillin or is it not Zman Tefillin? Now I go back to the Pirush of the Rambam. The Rambam says that according to Tanna Kama you wear one pair because Shabbat is Zman Tefillin, and according to Rabban Gamliel, says the Rambam in his Pirush of the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel Omer Shabbat la Zman Tefillin wa asur lahniham b'Shabbat, and it is asur to wear tefillin on Shabbat. So therefore you would wonder, how is it that we're being told here you should wear not one but two pairs? The Rambam explains, but because of this terrible situation of tefillin being in a state of bizayon, here it's mutar to do so. So we really see from this, by the way, that the isur of wearing tefillin, even on a day which is not zman tefillin, and even if we accept the view that a day which is not zman tefillin, it is asur to wear tefillin, this isur is not like chas v'shalom, like murdering someone, or worshipping Avodah Zarah, or what have you. It's considered improper, but it's not some terrible isur. If it was some terrible isur, which resulted in a person being considered, shall we say, hayav mitha, and I use that term for a very specific reason, as I'll tell you in a moment, then it's dubious, even taking into account the fact of the bizayon of the tefillin, it's dubious whether the Mishnah would be telling us that the person should go ahead and do this terrible sin of wearing tefillin on Shabbat, terrible in inverted commas, in order to save the tefillin, because he's risking his olam haba, he's doing something terrible. Why do I say this? Because the famous section in the Zohar Hadash on Megillat Ruth, which is the explicit source in the Zohar for not wearing tefillin on HaMoed, states that he who wears tefillin on HaMoed is hayav mitha. So, of course, you can claim, and I would claim, even that probably according to I would at least hope, even according to Ba'alei HaZohar, that this term is not to be taken literally. But the point that I'm making here is that the Rambam says in two places, both here and elsewhere, that wearing tefillin on Shabbat, which is not zman tefillin, is asur. But the word asur is also a word which has there's a whole range of things that are asur. Murder is asur, and insulting someone is asur also, but they're not the same level of asur. Correct? They're both asur, but they're not the same. Eating on Yom Kippur is asur, and driving recklessly on the road and endangering people is asur, but it's not exactly the same thing. Although both are very serious, okay, but they're different levels of isur. In the same way, asur la'nihan b'Shabbat doesn't mean that it's some terrible, inexpungible sin that will tip the scales against you, b'olam haba, and for this one thing of wearing tefillin one day on Chol HaMoed you will burn in hellfire forever. That's although many people apparently believe this is a very misguided understanding of what's being said here. So the Rambam, I return to the Rambam. The Rambam says, Rabban Gamliel omer Shabbat lo zman tefillin wa asur lahaniham Shabbat wa lo hitiru levishatam ela kedei lahasilan shelo yovedu. It's mutar to wear them in order to save them, so they shouldn't be destroyed or lost or what have you. Particularly, for example, if it's raining outside, they can get ruined in the rain. Ulefichach masilan shnaim. Klomar, kosher shnaim shel rosh berosho, ushnaim shel yad biyado. And the Rambam ends his pirush on this Mishnah by saying, "Wa'en halacha k'Rabban Gamliel." The halacha is not like Rabban Gamliel. In other words, the Rambam is being posek halacha like the Tanakh, like the Setham Mishnah, which is not unusual. That's perfectly normal. That's what one would expect. All things being equal, we should always expect the halakha to be like the Setham Mishnah. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's always the case, and Talmud Bavli is usually the case. But that's the reasonable assumption. The Rambam Vadai has a clear tendency, even when other Rishonim, for different reasons, are posek halakha, not like the Setham Mishnah, but by another opinion in the Mishnah. The Rambam and the Rif also have a clear leaning towards being posek halakha like the Stam Mishnah. So here the Rambam is doing the same. He's telling us halakha is like the Stam Mishnah, which means that you can, in such a situation on Shabbat, you can wear one pair at a time only, correct? Mm-hmm. However, just one moment, however, this is somewhat problematic, is it not? Because we just explained that, or the Rambam just explained to us, that according to the Tanakh, who says one pair at a time, Shabbat is zman tefillin, and according to Rabban Gamliel, Shabbat is not zman tefillin, he says two at a time. If that's the case, we should ask ourselves the obvious question, well, do we hold that Shabbat is zman tefillin, or that Shabbat lo zman tefillin? And we all know that we all hold, all the Rishonim, all the Geonim, without exception, hold that Shabbat lo zman tefillin. So clearly we should be being posek like halakha like Rabban Gamliel. How does the Rambam therefore tell us that this mahloket depends on the question of Shabbat zman tefillin or not, and therefore the halakha is not like Rabban Gamliel? It doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't. Just to prove this point, In Piskei Harid, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Ditrani, one of the greatest of the Rishonim, he brings this sugya, of course, in his Piskei Harid, the beginning of this Perek of Eruvin, and he explains the whole sugya, as the Talmud Bavli explains it, as the Rambam also just explained it, namely that Rabban Gamliel holds Shabbat lo Zman Tefillin, and therefore, because it's not Zman Tefillin, there's no Baal Tosif, and therefore, and because there is room to wear 2 tefillin, therefore you can wear 2 at a time. Perfectly reasonable, according to what we saw, everything makes sense. So, what should the halakha be? The Rambam, the Reed, goes on to say, having explained the sugya based on the Talmud Bavli, وَأَنْ halakha كَرَبِّ Meir Rabbi Yehuda. This, I should actually, before I read this sentence in the read, I should just mention or remind ourselves that the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli, and the Sadi Well, Amud Aleph, asks the question, a very reasonable question. Alright, we've decided that this mahloket of Rabban Gamliel and Tanakama is based on the question of Shabbat Zaman Tefillin or not. Well, who in fact holds that Shabbat is Zman Tefillin? The Talmud Bavli does its utmost to discover who amongst the Tanaim holds this opinion. Unfortunately, it doesn't really succeed in finding such an opinion. It tries to suggest at the end of the discussion, which is on Daf Sadi Well Amud Beth. Hold on 1 second, please. The end of discussion, which is on Sadi Well Amud Beth, line 5, it says as follows: Ela hai tanahu. It is this Tana who holds that Shabbat is Zman Tefillin. The Tanya, as it was taught, HaMoed Tefillin machnisam zur echad ha'ish ve'echad ha'isha. This is taken from the Tosefta here in Eruvin, at the end of Eruvin. And it says the same thing as the Mishnah. It just adds the words Ehad Ha'ish or Ehad Ha'isha, meaning that it doesn't make a difference whether the person who finds the tefillin on Shabbat lying on the ground is a man or a woman. This person may wear 1 pair of tefillin on Shabbat, put them on and bring them in. And this is the view of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees only on the question of Hadashot and Yeshanot. If you recall, there was a discussion of tefillin that have their straps tied on, and therefore it's clear that these are definitely tefillin and not kameoth, right? Because, as we see from this entire sugya, there was a practice among many people to wear a kameh, which looked identical, more or less at least, to tefillin. If in fact these are kameoth and not tefillin, you don't do anything with them on Shabbat, you leave them alone. Because a kameh is not a mini Sefer Torah. We don't even know what was written inside the kameh. It may be a pasuk from the Torah or something, it might be. It may also be some magical formula, and that's not being said lightly. We know what they used to write in kameoth. In fact, there are still people who write kameoth today, and you can go and see what they write. And we have, I remember seeing, for example, in the museum, there's a museum in Ramat HaGolan, in Kasrin, of things found in Ramat HaGolan. In Ramat HaGolan there were, in ancient times also, certainly in the time of the Talmud, there were definitely Jewish settlements, Jewish towns, etc. in the Golan. And they found there written on rolled up silver, for example. That's why it remained intact, engraved on a very thin piece of silver, rolled up like a mezuzah sort of, and then wrapped up in something like leather perhaps, and worn around the neck, or wrapped up in some kind of a box, or built into some kind of a leather enclosure like tefillin, and worn on the head or what have you. So there is all these. You can see them sitting there in the museum. You can read them. There are all kinds of magical incantations, turning to angels and what have you, save this person, or send refuah shlema to this girl. Apparently, this was a kameh written for a girl who was very ill, etc. So the point I'm making is simply that kameoth were worn by many people Not because it's a miswah to wear a kameh. There is no miswah to wear a kameh, because they believe that this protected you or saved you in some way. Whereas tefillin is not something that you wear in order to protect you physically or save you from something physical. It's a miswah. It's something which is a zikaron ben einecha, as it says in the pasuk. It's to remind us of our connection to Hashem, etc. We'll talk more about that another time. The concept, the fact that miswot are not designed as some kind of physical insurance policy or some kind of it's not like wearing body armor. That's how many people view miswot in general and the Torah in that way, and not just today, in the past as well. So according to this Baraitha that we just mentioned, the Tosefta, quoted by the Talmud Bavli here on Daf Sadi Well Amud Beth, line 5. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda agree that both a man and a woman can pick up tefillin they find lying somewhere, wear them, and walk into the house or walk into the city wearing them. And what does the Talmud Bavli wish to learn from this? From this we can see that they hold that if a woman can also wear the tefillin, it must be because they hold that this is a miswat aseh she'en zaman garama, that is not dependent on time, meaning that it's always a miswah, not at specific times, but always, including Shabbat. And that's why women can do this. The Talmud Bavli itself suggests that this is not the case, that this is not a proof, because perhaps they simply hold that it's not a miswah in the sense that it's a chovah for a woman to wear tefillin, because if you hold that it's a miswah aseh she'en zaman garama, then a woman is hayav to wear tefillin like a man. But one can also hold, and this is in fact the halacha, that it's not a chovah, but it's mutar for a woman to do a miswah. She's not required to do, whether it's shofar or lulav or sfirat or omer or tefillin. So the Talmud Bavli brings a very, very weak proof, tries to bring a very weak proof that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir do not hold that if a woman is patur from something, she may nevertheless do it. But as I already pointed out last week, this is a very poor and very unsatisfactory proof indeed, and I don't need to quote anything more than Rabbeinu Hananel, who here in the middle of this daf on the side of the page writes, La idbarar lan man haytana de savar shabbat zman tefillin. We still do not know, still has not become apparent to us, says Rabbeinu Hananel, who this Tana who holds that Shabbat is not zman tefillin, who this might be. So apparently Rabbeinu Hananel also felt that this was not really proved at all. Although other Rishonim, such as the Rashba, writes in Teshuvah, that implying that this is definitely proved from here, that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda hold that Shabbat is zman tefillin. So that was the Talmud Bavli suggesting that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda hold that Shabbat is zman tefillin. The read in Piskei Arid, to which I return now, says, En halacha Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yehuda da amri Shabbat zman tefillin. The halacha is not like these two Tanaim. It appears from here that the read also accepts the argument that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda hold that Shabbat is zman tefillin. Ela Rabbi Akiva u'Rabbi Yosef HaGilili, because we saw from the Baraitha quoted on Sadi Waw Amud Aleph, we saw that both Rabbi Yosef HaGilili and Rabbi Akiva both hold that Shabbat is not zman tefillin. They learn it, or they attach this fact, this halachic fact, to a different pesukim. One learns it from Ushamartat Achuka Hazot Miyamin Yamima, Lemu'adha Miyamin Yamima. The other learns it from Wayala Oth Al Yadacha, but they agree that Shabbat is not a time for wearing tefillin. So, and the read goes on to prove from the Sugya that discusses the question of Zaman tefillin in Masechet Menahoth, Daf Lamed Waw Amud Beth, where it says, Amar Rabba Barahuna, Safek Hashecha, Safek Lo Hashecha. If it's not clear whether it's night yet or not, Lo Holes, Lo Maniach. You don't have to take them off, but you're also not allowed to put them on. Ha Wadai Hashecha Holes. But once it's clear that it's night, you remove them. So we see from this, and he's an Amura, so we see that he is posek Rabbi Bar-Huna is posek that Laila is not Zaman Tefillin, and if Laila is not Zaman Tefillin, Shabbat is also Laila not Zaman Tefillin. And that's also, and there it's also talking, it's talking about Shabbat over there in Menachot and night. As the reader explains, he says, "V'ukimna hatham de be'erev Shabbat mari." That this statement of Rabbi Bar-Huna is referring to erev Shabbat. So on Friday evening, when it's not clear yet that it's mamash night, you may still keep your tefillin on. Whereas if it's now clear, it's no longer safek hashecha, safek en hashecha, ela, it is now clear that it is hashecha, which means it is definitely Shabbat, you must remove your tefillin. This is the statement of Rabbi Bar-Huna was referring to erev Shabbat. So it says in the Gemara in Menachot Daf Lamed Amud Bet. And the read says, and therefore we see that the halacha is that Shabbat is lo zman tefillin, which is also an accepted fact by all. By the way, we see from this statement quoted here by the reader of Rabbi Bar-Huna that on erev Shabbat, or at night at least, on erev Shabbat, one must remove tefillin. It is clear that the minhag, the practice of people, was to wear tefillin on Friday all day till the end of the day, also till Shabbat. Correct? This also contradicts, or this clear halachic statement contradicts the opinion of many Mekubalim, sometimes associated with the Ari, but this is incorrect. In this case, the Ari did not make such a statement, nor did he act in such a way. But some Mekubalim make the claim that, similar to what we're discussing with regards to Hol HaMoed, we see this as a general mindset and approach amongst Mekubalim in different ages, of finding more and more times during the year, or different times of the week, that one should not be wearing tefillin. So there are some Mekubalim who, in fact many, this is the accepted view today amongst most people who claim they follow the Kabbalah, even if they happen to be someone who wears tefillin all day, they will not wear tefillin after Hasof on Yom Shishi, after midday on Yom Shishi. In other words, they say that the Kedusha of Shabbat really begins to permeate the space-time continuum, to use Albert Einstein's conception of space-time. The space-time continuum begins to be permeated with Kiddushat Shabbat already at Hasof on Yom Shishi, and therefore you should not be wearing tefillin, even if you normally wear tefillin all day, and wearing tefillin all day is a very good thing. They themselves will tell you this. On Friday after Hasof, you shouldn't be wearing tefillin. This statement here, Rabbi Bar-Huna, which says that you do not need to remove your tefillin until it's definitely nighttime on Friday night, on El Shabbat, proves the opposite. It also happens to be the case that I discovered many years ago that, and because it's many years ago, I don't remember the name of the book or the author, but there was a certain Mekubal in Safaf at the time that the Ari was in Safaf. He knew the Ari personally, and mentions different things that he saw the Ari do, or that the Ari said that he heard, and he recorded these things. And in this book, I think it's in manuscript form, perhaps still. I'm not entirely sure. It's not a very well-known book at any rate. But I did see it quoted somewhere once. It says there explicitly that he knew the Ari, and he saw the Ari on Friday afternoons, just close to Shabbat, samuch l'Shabbat, wearing tefillin. So it just shows you that certain Mekubalim make all kinds of assumptions and explain or extrapolate from certain things that they learn from earlier sources. They extrapolate from that other things, and they go several steps beyond what their predecessors had done. Sometimes clearly not, and they end up with they come up with conclusions that clearly do not even sit well with someone like the Ari himself.
Ari never wrote and read the Zohar.
No. It does not say in the Zohar anything at all about wearing tefillin on Shabbat afternoon. the idea of not wearing tefillin on Friday afternoon is not mentioned in the Zohar. It's also not mentioned in Kidvei Ha'ari. It's mentioned by certain latter-day Mekubalim of the last 300 years. And I mentioned that there is a book written by a certain Mekubal who knew the Rebbe personally and actually saw what his practices were, who saw him wearing tefillin Erev Shabbat, Samuch l'Shabbat, which shows that those latter-day Mekubalim are mistaken. And this is not, even according to the Kabbalah, that's not true. But it does serve to indicate for us that the general thrust of many Mekubalim, in fact, basically one could say all Mekubalim over the centuries, and maybe even more than that, is to limit or to limit the time or to detract from those hours and those days of the year when one does wear tefillin, because of this idea that a certain time, a certain day, or a certain part of the day is very holy, and therefore one does not wear tefillin at that time. And I mentioned that from the Talmud in Masechet Menachot we see the exact opposite, that tefillin were worn all day on Erev Shabbat as well. There's also other proofs. There are, in fact, many other proofs. There's an explicit Mishnah which speaks about a person wearing tefillin Erev Shabbat and then being walking and trying to reach a certain place before Shabbat commences and not getting there in time, and then what should he do with his tefillin until he actually gets to where he's going? What should he do? He can't carry them, so he has to cover them or what have you. So that also proves clearly that tefillin were being worn on Friday afternoon. So we have more than sufficient proof for that to prove this is not the case. At any rate, as I said, there are many proofs. You're referring to the Gemara that discusses when Rabbi Eliezer was about to pass away, and it's clear from, and it says it was on Erev Shabbat, and it was near Shabbat, it was close to Shabbat, and it's clear from what it says over there that Rabbi Eliezer was wearing tefillin. So again, we have many proofs that this is not the case. But as with this issue of, exactly as with one more time, let's try this again. Exactly as it is with this issue of HaMoed, that one can have many proofs or near proofs, both proofs and near proofs, I think we have both, regarding the fact that one must wear tefillin on HaMoed. And despite this fact, people today, many people today will tell you, well, it says in the Zohar, no Kubalim say such and such, and therefore forget it, there's nothing to discuss bichlal. In other words, ra'ayot, proofs and texts count for nothing. That's why I said at the beginning of the Shiur, one of the essential questions that we have to deal with here is, do texts mean anything? Does the Mishnah mean anything? Does the Gemara mean anything? Does any text mean anything? Or is the only yardstick upon which we can and should base our halachic practice, and not just halachic practice, also other areas of Jewish life, such as thought and beliefs and theological concepts, etc., is the only source that is authoritative and meaningful, and the only text that we have to take at face value and not say that it might be explained differently, or it might be even a machloket within the Zohar or something like that, are Kabbalistic texts, and they always somehow, in the eyes of some people, always somehow superior and supersede all other sources. So just as it is so with HaMoed, it is the same applies to Erev Shabbat after Hasoth. There are many explicit proofs that one wears tefillin all day on Friday, just like any other day of the week, until Shabbat. But in the eyes of those people who are convinced that by an opinion, as soon as that opinion is connected to or associated with Kabbalah, all you have to do is say the word Kabbalah, or Al-Pi HaEmef, or Al-Pi Hasod, or some such expression. As soon as you say that, the discussion is over. There's nothing else to discuss. There's no Mishnah, and there's no Talmud Bavli, and there's no Talmud Yerushalmi, and there's no Rambam, and the Rosh doesn't know what he's saying, and there's nothing left to discuss. That is the approach that exists in many places and in the minds of many people, and this is exactly why we're discussing this issue, because this approach runs counter to everything that the Torah is about. I don't want to go into the issue of whether in detail of whether the Zohar itself contradicts itself regarding Tefillin on Chol HaMoed, but I'll just mention in passing that in the famous Teshuvah, Siman Lamed Waw or Lamed Zayin, two essentially Lamed Zayin, a very, very long, detailed Teshuvah of the Mishkenot Yaakov, who was a tremendous Chacham, a Talmid of Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, who was the Gra. He proves at great length that one must wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and he also proves that in the Zohar itself we find another sugya, another place in the Zohar where it seems that it holds that one does wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. In other words, there is an opinion in the Zohar Hadash in Ruth where it says explicitly, do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And if you do, it's a very terrible thing, because you're insulting the oath of Chol HaMoed, of the Moed of Pesach or Sukkot, and you mustn't do this. And if you do so, you're Hayav Mitah. But there's another sugya, there's another place in the Zohar which he quotes, and I don't want to go into that now because that would involve us in analyzing these different sugyot and texts in the Zohar, and I don't want to go into that now. But if you want to look it up, it's there in Mishkenot Yaakov, Siman Lamed Zayin, and he explains it at length how even according to Balei HaZohar, this sugya was a machloket. So, I return now to Piskei HaRiv. The Riv explained the sugya in Eruvin as the Talmud Bavli explains it, that the Tanna Kama holds Shabbat is Zman Tefillin, and the Rabban Gamliel holds Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin. And therefore he goes on to say, although he doesn't actually say it explicitly, but he implies that seeing that we hold that Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin, so therefore we hold like Rabban Gamliel, and therefore the halakha is that you bring them in two at a time and not one at a time. Make sense? Nachon? Fine. And that's exactly what you would expect. And that's exactly what his grandson, the Riaz, also one of the great Rishonim, writes explicitly. He writes in Chot Riaz, Piskei Riaz, Perek Yod of Eruvin, Halacha Aleph, he writes, HaMoset Tefillin b'Shabbat b'Reshut HaRabim, Harei ze meniach b'Zra'o v'Rosho shtei zugot. You wear two pairs at a time. Lefi shemakom yesh b'Rosh l'niach bo shtei tefillin, etc. So he's following in his grandfather's footsteps. So we see that if one holds that Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin, that's in fact what we all hold, we should all be being posek halacha like Rabban Gamliel. But what do we discover when we open up most of the Rishonim? We find this is not so. The Rambam in his Pirush on the Mishnah told us that the machloket depends, as we said, on Shabbat Zman Tefillin or not, and then he says halacha is not like Rabban Gamliel, which is a contradiction. And in the Mishneh Torah, the Rambam is also there posek halacha like the Tana Kama, not like Rabban Gamliel. The Rambam, it's in Hilchot Shabbat Perek Yotef. I'll read it again. Read it last week, but I'll read it again. Halacha Kav Gimel, Hamoset Tefillin b'Shabbat b'Reshut HaRabim, Kesad hu oseh. What do you do? Loveshan kedarkam. You wear them as you normally do, namely, Meniach l'rosh b'rosho v'shel hayad b'yado, one pair at a time. When Nichnas v'holsan b'bayit, you take them off and you leave them in the house, and then you go back and do it again. V'chozeh v'yoseh v'lovesh zug sheni v'holso ad sheyachnis et kulam, until you bring them all in, as many as there are. So we really do need to understand how can the Rambam tell us that this is this machloket depends on this machloket of Shabbat Zman Tefillin, and then turn around and tell us that we hold like the Tanakh who says that Shabbat is Zman Tefillin. The Rambam himself holds that Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin. And this is not just a kusha on the Rambam. The same kusha can be asked of the Rosh, who holds that Shabbat is not Zman Tefillin. And then on the other hand, when it comes to this inyan, the Rosh following in the footsteps of the Rif, and the Rif is very important here. The Rif does exactly the same thing, and the Rosh says the same thing. He's posek halacha like the Tanakh. In fact, he hardly really explains the whole sugya, the Rosh I'm referring to now, and the same is true with the Rif. He just brings the Mishnah and discusses the question of Hadashot and Yeshanot, in other words, whether it's a Kamea or not a Kamea. But he actually doesn't even suggest that the Machloket has anything to do with Shabbat Zman Tefillin or not Zman Tefillin. If he wants to ascertain, this is the general rule of thumb, what the Rosh meant, if it's somehow, for some reason, unclear to you what the Rosh meant to say, all one needs to do is to look at Kisur Piskei HaRosh, which was written by his son, the Tur, Bara Turim, which always appears immediately after the Rosh. And what does he say? In other words, this is Rabbeinu Yaakov Bala Turim summing up what his father wrote. He says, HaMoed Tefillin b'derech b'Shabbat, im yesh b'hem resuot, v'hen kishurot, if they have resuot tied onto them, like Tefillin normally do, yachnisem zug zug, you bring them in one at a time, derech malbush. In other words, wearing them as one normally does. He doesn't say two. So, what's going on here? The Rambam, the Rosh, the Rif also. You look up to the Rif, you would expect the Rif to explain, just as you would expect the Rosh to explain, as the Rambam did explain to us in his portion of the Mishnah, that seeing that this machloket depends on this other machloket, therefore the halacha is such and such. We don't find that. We find that all these poskim, the Rosh, the Rif, for some reason, it's as if they never saw the sugya in Talmud Bavli. There's a whole sugya which is about a daf long, which attempts to demonstrate that the mahloket is dependent on this question of Shabbat Zman Tefillin or not, and then tries to find someone who actually holds this view that Shabbat is Zman Tefillin. It's as if they never heard of the sugya. What does the Rif do? The Rif brings the Mishnah, just quotes the Mishnah word for word, and exactly as the Rosh did, because the Rosh, I mentioned the Rosh first, but of course the Rosh came after the Rif. The Rosh did what it was following in the Rif's footsteps, which, by the way, he does very often. He just quotes the discussion about Hadashot and Yeshanot, where it's a Kamea or not a Kamea. Anything to do with Shabbat or not Shabbat, he has no clue. He's never heard of such a thing. What exactly is going on here? The explanation, or the beginning of the explanation to all this, may be found in the Perush on the Rif, which appears here. The Perush on this, on the Rif to Masechet Eruvin, is not the Ran, and it's not the Nimukei Yosef. It's another Rishon, whose name is Rabbeinu Yehonathan Milunel. Lunel is a town in southern France, in Provence. He actually wrote a Perush on Hilchot Arif to I think, if I'm not mistaken, 21 Masechtot. And we have it today. It wasn't, for different reasons, it wasn't always apparently available or very well known, but Rabbeinu Yonathan Milunel is well known and quoted by many authorities in many places, wherever they had his works. And he explains the Rif, as he always does, in a very straightforward and logical manner. And he says as follows. So if those of you have the Gemara in front of you, you can look it up. It's in the Dapei Arif, it's Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beth. I'm sorry, Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. Beginning of the Perek HaMoed Tefillin. And it says as follows. HaMoed Tefillin, Rabbeinu Yonathan says, Perush, HaMoed Tefillin b'Shabbat, b'makom ha'aved, in a place where the tefillin are likely to be destroyed or lost or damaged, or in general they're sitting they're in a situation where they're in a state of bizayon. although he doesn't actually use the word bizion, he says makom ha'aved, where they may be destroyed or something. אף על פי שגזרו חכמים בהנחת תפילין בשבת משום שמא תיפסק הרצועה ווביאם בידו. This is very, very important what Rabbi Yonatan says here. He explains that בעצם Shabbat is zman tefillin. In other words, minat Torah, so Rabbi Yonatan says, minat Torah, we would be wearing tefillin on Shabbat, why not? It's very logical perhaps in many ways, you would say. It's a holy day, a special day. You should be wearing tefillin on Shabbat more than during the week perhaps. But he explains that really Shabbat is minat Torah is a time when you would wear tefillin. However, the Chachamim were gozer not to wear tefillin on Shabbat because what happens, for example, the person is outside Reshut HaRabim and he has to go to the bathroom. He has to remove his tefillin, so therefore he's going to carry them. And as we've mentioned on many occasions, Hazal had not heard of the very clever contrivance of an eruv Reshut HaRabim, in which case you can do exactly as you please and carry whatever you like. They hadn't heard of this, and they were concerned that the people would carry tefillin Reshut HaRabim. So therefore, Rabbi Yonatan explains, שגזרו החכמים בהנחת תפילין בשבת משום שמא תיפסק הרצועה, because the strap may tear on Shabbat. Keep in mind, by the way, that straps were much narrower and thinner than they are today, probably, and therefore snapping was even more common than it would be today. وَVِيَمْ بِيَذَوْ, and they will carry them. وَأَفِيلُ, that's one of you. وَأَفِيلُ لَمَنْ دَامَ الشَّبَّاث لَوْ زَمَنْ تَفِلِينَ, and even according to he who says that minat Torah, Shabbat is not the time for wearing tefillin. كَيْوَانْ دَبَهَنَا حَثَانْ لَكَ حَيُّوْ حَتَى, seeing that wearing them on Shabbat does not carry the hiyuv of a hatat. In other words, it's not considered hilul Shabbat wearing tefillin. It's not like cooking on Shabbat or something like that. כדאית במסכת שבת פרק אישה יוצאה משום שדרך מלבוש avidan, seeing that these are things that you wear, like clothing or like jewelry, therefore it's not considered masoy, it's not considered something that you carry. For this reason, women may wear, or at least minat Torah, women may wear jewelry on Shabbat. Chazal were gozer regarding certain kinds of jewelry that women should not wear b'Reshut HaRabim, precisely for this reason. They may take it off, they may show a friend of theirs, look at this beautiful ring that I got or something, and then end up carrying it in Reshut HaRabim. Mishum derech malbush avidan v'lo masoyhu hachanami mishum hasala d'chitvei HaKodesh, seeing that here we're talking about saving, protecting and honoring, showing respect for Kitvei HaKodesh, in other words, parshiyot from the Torah that are written in Tefillin. Sharo le Rabbanan la'asulinho derech malbush. Therefore, the Chachamim allowed the wearing of Tefillin in the normal manner, which is considered wearing and not carrying. Komo shitiru lo lahasil tik hasefer im hasefer v'tik haTefillin im haTefillin lahaser she'ena me'orevet o lamavoi she'eno mefurash. So Rabbi Yonatan just explained to us there are two ways of understanding this whole issue. Either that Shabbat is zman tefillin, even though we don't have any source amongst the Tanaim who actually come out and say such a thing, but the Chachamim said not to wear tefillin on Shabbat for the reasons explained. But there are other explanations as well. As we see in the Mechilta, we find a couple of drashot from Tanaim which say that one should not lo yiten oth ba'oth, that a day which is itself considered an oath like Shabbat, he shouldn't as it were ignore the fact that the day itself is an oath such as Shabbat and wear something or do something which is for the purpose of being an oath such as tefillin. So there you already have the idea, the basis of the idea that it's asur or improper, in other words, to wear tefillin on Shabbat. There's also the possibility that Shabbat is in fact not zaman tefillin, but anything that you wear is mutar. It's not considered carrying, and in this case it's mutar to wear them in order to save them, to protect them. Rabbi Yonatan continues, and he says, "Machnisan zug." That's the first opinion of the Mishnah. And of course, the Rif, if he doesn't explicitly said otherwise, halacha is like the Stam Mishnah. If the Rif held that the halacha is like Rabban Gamliel, he would clearly say halacha is like Rabban Gamliel. But he doesn't say such a thing. Rabbeinu Yonathan says, Kederech Shelo Sham Behol, you wear one pair at a time, as you do during the week. And you do this until you bring them all in. But Rabban Gamliel matil bosh bizra shtayim shtayim shezra uvarosh shtayim shtayim sherosh. Why is this? They explain in the Gemara that Rabban Gamliel holds, and listen well, the Svira le Rabban Gamliel dechewan de mishum hasala hitiru hachamim, seeing that we're allowing this bichlal, this wearing of tefillin on Shabbat in order to protect and save and honor the tefillin. Sharo le lilbosh shne zugot, they allowed him to wear 2 pairs. Aval tofeh la, but not more than 2, even not 3. Dela mikro derech malbush ela shne zugot levadan, because it's only considered derech malbush up to 2. Why? And because there is room on the arm and the head to wear 2. So as long as it's being worn by makom tefillin, it's considered a malbush. Just as, again, if I wear a hat on my head, then that's fine, that's considered malbush. If I wear a hat tied to my knee, then it's not malbush, then I'm doing something strange. I'm not wearing the hat, I'm carrying the hat. In the same way, if you wear tefillin where it is makom tefillin, you're wearing tefillin. Wearing is not carrying. If you wear tefillin elsewhere, then it's not the mitzvah of tefillin bichlal. It's not wearing tefillin, it's carrying tefillin. Aval Tana kama savar la sharenan ela zug ehad. But the first Tana, the Stam Mishnah holds that we only allow 1 pair at a time. Sharei im levash b'chol shnayim shnayim. Here, the Rabbeinu Yonathan introduces the concept of Baal Tosif, as we see in the Talmud Bavli, because during the week, if you were to wear 2 at a time, ka'avar mishum Baal Tosif. Lefichach le'inyan hasala nami zog ahad en tafeh la. Now, anyone who followed what I just read will immediately recognize the simple fact that Rabbeinu Yonathan, in his Perush on the Rif here, he's explaining the position of the Rif and explaining the halacha. He just explained the mahloket between the Tana Kama and Rabban Gamliel without any reference to the concept of Shabbat Zman Tefillin or not Zman Tefillin. Again, it's as if the Rabbeinu Yonathan did not even know there's such a Gemara. Now, all of this, of course, has to make you wonder what's going on here. Now, some of you will recall that I mentioned last time that this whole sugya in the Talmud Bavli is a relatively late sugya. There was the lengthy discussion of offering 4 or 5 different possibilities to explain the difference of opinion between the Tana Kama and Rabban Gamliel is a later sugya, and it goes out on a limb. In other words, it goes as far as suggesting that Shabbat is Zaman Tefillin, according to some, in order to try and explain this machloket. But in fact, what we just saw, both in the Rif and in the Rosh, and now in Rabbeinu Yonathan, we see that these Rishonim are explaining this Mishnah and explaining the machloket between. The Rosh doesn't say so explicitly, but the Rosh is following in the Rif's footsteps, and the Rif is by being posek halacha like the Tana Kama, just as the Rambam does, that you bring in 1 zug at a time. Then they're basically hinting very broadly that we do not make this connection between the concept of Shabbat Zaman Tefillin or not, and the question of 1 pair or 2 pairs. In other words, there is another way of understanding this machloket of 1 pair or 2 pairs at a time. What do we see in the Talmud Bavli itself? In Talmud Bavli we also see that there's another way of explaining the whole thing. The first statement in the Talmud Bavli, which appears in line 16, Daf Sadih HaMoed Beth, it says, Amar Rabba, Afilu Tema Rabbi Meir, Hafam derech malbusho kahol shavei Rabbanan, Wahacha derech malbusho kahol shavei Rabbanan. that just as regarding the question of saving belongings from a fire that breaks out on Shabbat, Rabbi Meir said you can wear whatever one can wear in order to move it from that house on Shabbat. The same applies here with tefillin. Whatever can be worn, you wear, and tefillin can be worn, so you wear them.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.